There are tunnels beneath the Australian landscape that were not dug by people or carved by water. They were made by fire. Lava tubes are formed when active lava flows develop a hardened outer crust while the molten rock inside continues to flow. As the eruption subsides and the lava drains out, the hardened outer shell remains. A hollow tunnel of solidified basalt, sometimes running for kilometers beneath the surface, sometimes branching and interconnecting into networks of passages extending across areas of hundreds of square kilometers. They are found on every continent where volcanic activity has occurred. Hawaii has them. Iceland has them. The Canary Islands have them. The lava tube systems of these locations have been studied extensively and are known in reasonable detail. Australia's lava tubes have not been studied extensively, and what researchers have found inside them when they have looked carefully is producing findings that none of them expected and that are revising the understanding of Australian geological history, the history of life on this continent, and the antiquity of human engagement with the underground landscape of the Australian interior. Not one finding. A pattern of findings from multiple tube systems across different parts of the continent, each one adding to a picture that the individual findings alone do not reveal. When you put those findings together, the underground volcanic landscape of Australia looks nothing like what the surface suggests. If you are new here, this channel covers Australian history, science, and country that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below whether you knew that Australia had lava tubes before watching this video today. Let us start with where Australia's lava tubes are and how they formed. Because the existence of lava tubes in Australia surprises most people who did not know the country had any significant volcanic history. Australia is not currently a volcanically active continent. There are no active volcanoes within the Australian continent proper. The last significant volcanic eruptions within what is now Australian territory occurred much more recently than most Australians realize, but they are not happening now, and the casual assumption that the Australian continent is and has always been geologically dead is widespread. It is also wrong. Eastern Australia has been subject to volcanic activity produced by a geological mechanism known as hotspot volcanism over a period extending from approximately 34 million years ago to as recently as 5,000 years ago. A hotspot is a region of elevated heat flow from the mantle that does not correspond to a plate boundary, a fixed point of thermal anomaly relative to the overlying plate that produces a chain of volcanic centers as the plate moves over it. The Australian plate has been moving northward at approximately 7 centimeters per year for tens of millions of years. As it has moved, the hotspot beneath it has produced a chain of volcanic centers along the eastern part of the continent, from the oldest and most eroded in the north of Queensland to the youngest and least eroded in Western Victoria and South Australia. The most recent volcanic activity in Australia occurred at Mount Gambier in South Australia, which last erupted approximately 5,000 years ago. It occurred at Tower Hill in Victoria, which erupted approximately 30,000 years ago. It occurred across the newer volcanics province of Western Victoria and southeastern South Australia, a volcanic field covering approximately 19,000 square kilometers that was active for a period beginning several million years ago and ending with the most recent eruptions 5,000 years ago. People were in Australia during all of these eruptions. The earliest confirmed human presence in Australia is at least 65,000 years ago. The eruptions at Tower Hill 30,000 years ago and at Mount Gambier 5,000 years ago both occurred well within the period of human occupation. The people who witnessed those eruptions were the ancestors of the Aboriginal communities whose country includes those volcanic centers today. The lava tubes of Australia are distributed along this hotspot chain, concentrated in the newer volcanics province of Victoria and South Australia but present also in Queensland, where older lava flows from earlier hotspot activity produce tube systems that are now significantly older and more modified by the geological processes that alter the underground environment over millions of years. Now let us talk about the specific tube systems that have produced the most significant findings. Because the research is concentrated at a small number of sites where access and investigation have been possible, and those sites have individually and collectively produced results that extend well beyond what standard geological description of lava tubes conveys. The Undara lava tubes in far north Queensland are the most extensively studied lava tube system in Australia and among the most significant in the world. The Undara system was formed approximately 190,000 years ago when Mount Garnet, a shield volcano in the Atherton Tablelands region, produced an enormous lava flow that traveled down a river valley for approximately 160 kilometers, one of the longest lava flows from a single eruption documented anywhere on Earth. As the outer surface of the flow cooled and hardened, the interior continued to flow, and when the eruption subsided, the interior drained out, leaving a network of tubes beneath the basalt surface. The Undara tubes extend for at least 160 kilometers of mapped passage, making the system one of the longest lava tube networks in the world. The longest individual tube at Undara reaches approximately 1.5 kilometers in length. The tubes range from intimate passages requiring crawling to cathedral-like chambers of several meters height and width. What lives inside them is the first unexpected finding. The biological communities inside the Undara lava tubes were first systematically surveyed in the 1990s, and the surveys have continued with increasing sophistication since. What the biological researchers found inside the tubes was a community of cave-adapted organisms of unexpected diversity and with evolutionary relationships that illuminate the history of life in this part of Australia in ways that surface biology does not. The invertebrate fauna of the Undara tube system includes numerous species of cave-adapted spiders, beetles, and other arthropods that show the characteristic adaptations of organisms that have spent extended periods in the lightless underground environment. Reduced or absent eyes. Depigmented bodies. Extended appendages that compensate for the loss of visual sensing with enhanced mechanoreception and chemoreception. These are the hallmarks of organisms that have been living in caves for long enough that the selection pressure of the cave environment has produced morphological changes across multiple generations. Extended long enough means thousands of generations at minimum for the degree of adaptation observed. The organisms in the Undara tubes have been there for a very long time. The phylogenetic analysis of the cave-adapted species, comparing their DNA to the DNA of their surface-dwelling relatives, allows researchers to estimate how long the cave lineages have been isolated from their surface relatives. The estimates produced from these analyses suggest that some of the cave-adapted lineages in the Undara system have been isolated in the underground environment for periods extending back hundreds of thousands of years, possibly longer. This means that the ancestors of these organisms were in the Undara tubes, or in precursor underground environments that were replaced or connected to the current system, before the current tube system in its present form was created 190,000 years ago. The underground environment of this part of Queensland has been continuously inhabited by organisms that are now cave-adapted for longer than the current tube system has existed. The tubes are new relative to the history of cave life within them. This finding raises questions about the continuity of underground habitat in this region across geological time that the current research is only beginning to address. The biological findings from the Undara system have been published in a series of papers in international journals of biospeleology and evolutionary biology. The most significant species descriptions have attracted attention within those specialist communities. They have not been widely reported in mainstream science media or in any public account of the Undara lava tubes that reaches a general audience. The tourist experience of the Undara tubes focuses, reasonably, on the dramatic scale of the tube passages and the remarkable story of their geological formation. The biological significance of what lives inside them is not the centerpiece of the experience that visitors receive. Now let us talk about the newer volcanic province lava tubes of Victoria and South Australia, because these are where the most recent and most surprising findings have been produced. The lava tubes of the Mount Eccles and Budge Bim volcanic complex in Western Victoria, and the associated tube systems that extend from these centers, were formed in eruptions that the research of the last 2 decades has dated to periods overlapping significantly with the human history of the region. Mount Eccles last erupted approximately 30,000 years ago. The lava flows from that eruption traveled across the landscape of what is now the Budge Bim National Park and the surrounding region, burying the pre-existing landscape and creating the surface geology of basalt flows that characterizes this part of Western Victoria today. The Budge Bim volcanic complex is the site of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Australian history, announced to the world in 2019 and recognized by UNESCO in the same year. The Gunditjmara people, the traditional custodians of the Budge Bim country, constructed an elaborate aquaculture system in the channels and wetlands created by the ancient lava flows. They engineered a network of channels, weirs, and holding ponds in the volcanic landscape to trap, manage, and harvest short-finned eels on a scale that constitutes one of the oldest and most sophisticated food production systems documented anywhere in the world. The Bujbim aquaculture system has been dated by archaeological research to at least 6,600 years ago, making it older than the Egyptian pyramids and significantly older than most of the agricultural systems that conventional history treats as the foundations of complex civilization. The Gunditjmara were not hunter-gatherers in the simple sense that term is usually applied to pre-agricultural societies. They were food producers, landscape engineers, and managers of a complex ecological system in a volcanic landscape that they understood in extraordinary detail. UNESCO recognition of the Bujbim cultural landscape as a World Heritage Site, announced in 2019, placed this system in the same category of global significance as the Great Barrier Reef, the Sydney Opera House, and the Kakadu National Park. The lava tubes of the Bujbim complex have not received the same attention as the aquaculture system in the public coverage of the site. But the research conducted in and around those tubes as part of the broader archaeological investigation of the Bujbim landscape has produced findings that connect the underground volcanic environment to the human history of the site in ways that are significant. The tubes beneath the Bujbim volcanic landscape contain evidence of human use extending back into the period following the most recent eruptions that created the landscape. The dating of charcoal recovered from archaeological deposits within accessible tube sections places human activity within the tubes at a period close to the beginning of the aquaculture system's development at the surface above. The tubes were used. The question of what they were used for, beyond the most practical interpretations of shelter and food storage in the cool, stable environment of the underground, is one that requires engagement with Gunditjmara knowledge to answer properly. The Gunditjmara have described the volcanic landscape of Bujbim in terms that encode an understanding of its character and its history that extends back to its formation. Their dreaming stories of Bujbim describe the volcanic center as a being, an ancestor whose body and actions created the landscape. The channels of the aquaculture system are understood in Gunditjmara tradition not simply as engineering works, but as features of a landscape that was shaped by ancestral forces whose nature the dreaming stories describe in specific terms. Whether those traditional descriptions encode accurate knowledge of the geological processes that created the lava landscape, as the Jara description of Wolf Creek crater encodes accurate knowledge of the impact process, is a question that the researchers working at Bujbim have engaged with seriously. The correspondence between the Gunditjmara understanding of the volcanic landscape's formation and the geological understanding of how lava flows and associated tube systems are created has been noted in the published research, without the full implications of that correspondence being systematically addressed. Now let us talk about what has been found in the tubes from a purely physical and chemical perspective. Because the interior environment of lava tubes has properties that distinguish it from other underground environments in ways that are scientifically significant and that have not been adequately reported in any public account of Australian lava tubes. The temperature inside a lava tube is stable. This is a property of underground environments generally, where the thermal mass of the surrounding rock buffers the interior against the daily and seasonal temperature fluctuations of the surface above. The stable temperature of the Undara tubes is approximately 23 degrees Celsius year-round, in a surface environment that can reach 45 degrees in summer and drop below 10 degrees in winter at night. This temperature stability, combined with the high humidity of the tube interior, creates an environment that is dramatically different from the surface in ways that go beyond the obvious absence of light. The combination of stable temperature, high humidity, and complete darkness creates conditions that are optimal for specific biological and chemical processes that do not operate efficiently in the variable conditions of the surface environment. The chemical processes that occur on the surfaces of lava tube walls, the slow dissolution and redeposition of minerals by water moving through the tube, the biological transformation of minerals by the microbial communities that coat the tube walls, produce features called speleothems, stalactites, stalagmites, and other mineral formations that are the same class of features found in limestone caves but produced by different chemical pathways in the basaltic environment of a lava tube. The speleothems of the Australian lava tubes are scientifically significant because they record in their chemistry the conditions of the tube environment at the time of their formation. The isotopic composition of the carbonate minerals deposited in speleothems reflects the temperature and moisture conditions of the environment during deposition, creating a chemical archive of the environmental history of the tube system across the period of speleothem growth. Research teams applying isotopic analysis to speleothems from the Undara tubes and from lava tubes in the newer volcanics province of Victoria have begun to extract climate records from these chemical archives. The climate information encoded in the speleothems of the Australian lava tubes extends back tens of thousands of years in some cases, providing records of temperature and moisture in the interior of the continent and in the volcanic landscapes of Victoria that supplement and in some cases extend the climate records available from other Australian archives. The microbial communities that coat the walls of the Australian lava tubes are another area where the research has produced unexpected findings. Lava tube walls support communities of microorganisms, primarily bacteria and archaea, that derive their energy not from sunlight but from chemical reactions involving the minerals of the basaltic rock. These chemolithotrophic microorganisms, organisms that eat rock in the functional sense of extracting chemical energy from mineral oxidation reactions, are among the most biologically unusual communities known on Earth. The diversity and metabolic versatility of the microbial communities in the Australian lava tubes has been assessed using modern DNA sequencing methods that allow researchers to characterize all the organisms in a community without the need to cultivate them in a laboratory. The results of these assessments, published in microbiology journals over the last decade, document communities of extraordinary diversity that include lineages not previously described from any environment. Some of the microbial lineages found in the Australian lava tubes are of interest to astrobiologists, researchers who study the potential for life in environments beyond the Earth, because the metabolic strategies they employ are analogous to the metabolic strategies that life might employ in subsurface environments on other planets where liquid water and chemical energy sources are available but sunlight is not. The Australian lava tubes are, in this sense, a laboratory for understanding how life can operate in conditions that are relevant to the search for life elsewhere in the solar system. The Australian Space Agency and research groups working on astrobiology have noted this connection in their published work. The lava tube environments of Australia are cited in the literature as analogues for the subsurface environments of Mars and other bodies that may harbor microbial life. Now let us talk about the human relationship with these underground spaces across the full span of human presence in Australia. Because the evidence for indigenous engagement with lava tube environments in Australia extends further back in time and across more of the tube systems than the Budgebim research alone suggests. Rock art has been documented in lava tube environments in Queensland, in Victoria, and in other parts of eastern Australia where the volcanic landscape has produced accessible tube systems. The dating of rock art in cave and tube environments is technically challenging, but where dates have been obtained from charcoal and other materials associated with art making in tube environments, they extend the evidence of human engagement with the underground volcanic landscape back to periods well within the early human history of the continent. The tube environments offer conditions for rock art preservation that are, in some cases, superior to open rock shelter environments. The stable temperature and humidity of the tube interior, the protection from weathering by wind and rainfall, and the darkness that prevents photochemical degradation of pigments all contribute to the long-term preservation of art in tube environments in ways that are different from the preservation conditions of exposed rock surfaces. What the art in these environments depicts, and what its placement in the specific physical settings of lava tube interiors means for the interpretation of the art, is a question that archaeologists and traditional knowledge holders are working through together in a process that has not yet produced complete published accounts. What is established is that the people who lived in the landscapes above these tube systems understood the tubes as significant spaces and engaged with them across a time period that extends back to the earliest period of human presence in the regions where the tubes are found. The underground volcanic landscape of Australia is not a curiosity. It is a dimension of the Australian environment that has been part of the human experience of this continent from very close to the beginning of that experience, that has shaped the ecological history of the species that have evolved within it, and that is only now beginning to be investigated with the tools necessary to understand its full scientific significance. Lava tubes made by fire. Inhabited by organisms evolving in darkness for hundreds of thousands of years. Recording the climate history of the continent in their chemical deposits. Harboring microbial communities relevant to the search for life beyond the Earth. Used by people whose ancestors witnessed the eruptions that created them and encoded that knowledge in traditions maintained to the present day. None of this is on the sign at the entrance to the tourist experience at Undara. The tours are excellent. The scale of the tubes is dramatic. The story of how they formed is remarkable. But the full account of what is inside them, and what has been inside them for longer than any human record extends, is significantly more remarkable than the tour covers. And the research that is assembling that full account is still in its early stages. The tubes are still mostly unexplored. The biological surveys are incomplete. The climate records from the speleothems have barely been begun. The microbial diversity has been sampled at a tiny fraction of the accessible tube surface. The archaeological investigation of the underground landscapes of the volcanic provinces is in its first generation of systematic work. What is inside Australia's lava tubes has already shocked the researchers who have looked carefully. What is still inside the ones that have not yet been entered is the question that the research is only beginning to ask. If this changed how you think about Australia's volcanic landscape, leave a comment below and subscribe for more Australian history and science that most people were never properly taught.